Hello once again, everyone, and welcome to the fifth and yes, final installment of our Chapter 3 lecture series, this one entitled Social Classes in the Colonies. The focus question for this section is, how did patterns of class and gender roles change in 18th century America? It is important to understand that in the English colonies prior to the American Revolution, there was no real sense of an American identity. Just the same that there was no sense of any sort of racial identity at the time either, as we have previously discussed. Various European cultures were able to maintain themselves within this wider cultural milieu that was going on in the English-American colonies at the time, while English colonists continued to assert their British identity, and more, even those of other ethnic groups who had immigrated into the colonies slowly over time began to assert a more British identity as well, especially after you get to the second and third generations of these immigrants who now are born in the Americas themselves. Now, the British identity in the colonies was defined in part in opposition to others, including Spanish and French Catholics, Africans, and Native Americans. So this British identity was established as a contrast to these other perceived identities at the time. Many in Great Britain itself saw the colonists as a collection of convicts, religious dissidents, and impoverished servants, basically those that had no real place in British society proper, if you will. And the British in England generally looked down upon the colonists in the New World. The assertion of this English, or by this time British, identity, Britain actually formed in 1707 with the unification of England, Scotland, and Wales. But this wider English or British identity that the colonists began to more and more associate with themselves was meant to counteract such perceptions by the mother country of the colonists as convicts, dissidents, impoverished servants, and what have you, and stake their own claim to a larger and greater status within the empire itself. At this time in the colonies, the expanding trade networks and increasingly profitable slave plantations produced a wealthy elite that came to dominate politics and society. New England was increasingly dominated by the merchant class with connections to London trading firms. In Virginia, planters expected to pass their wealth down, creating powerful family dynasties that really coalesced power into fewer and fewer hands as the colonial period progressed. Both attempted to establish a sort of pseudo-aristocracy modeled on the English aristocracy. Now, the aristocracy is essentially the nobility of England, and while there were no actual titles of nobility in the Americas, this wealthy elite desired to appropriate the trappings of this titled aristocracy as a way to, again, assert their English or British identity and their increasing wealth and status within the wider empire as a whole. They believed that only the wealthy and cultured were meant to govern, and their idea of liberty was defined as the power to rule those in the social classes beneath them. And freedom from labor, from hard manual labor with one's hands, became increasingly the mark of a refined gentleman amongst the elites of the American colonies. There was certainly substantial amounts of poverty in the American colonies in this period. The gap between rich and poor was just as wide, if not wider then, as it is now. However, in the American colonies, it was not quite as widespread as it was in Britain proper itself. The population growth at this time led to diminishing access to land. which led to fewer opportunities to acquire the land needed to establish self-sufficiency, which was the precursor to growing the wealth needed to rise in the social classes. So this population growth actually increased the amount of poverty at this time. There became increases in tenants who resided on other people's land and worked that land in exchange for a small piece of the profits of their labor, and also an increase in wage laborers as well, those who actually worked for an hourly or more often than not a daily wage at this point. The poor themselves were often viewed as lazy and shiftless. Many were sent to workhouses where essentially they were put into a system of coerced labor not that far removed from slavery. This drawing right here is a depiction of one of these poorhouses during the mid to late 18th century in the American colonies at this time. Others who weren't sent to these workhouses were exiled from the areas that they resided in. People generally did not want to associate with the impoverished and wanted to push them to the side and ignore them as much as possible in their particular districts and townships. The fastest growing class in the Americas at this time was the middle class, or the middle ranks, if you will. These were folks who were really taking advantage of that burgeoning consumer or market revolution undergoing and were tied in to that expanding Atlantic economy that we've been discussing. Most of them were successful small farmers throughout the colonies, but there were also merchants and artisans, those who manufactured things with their hands, cobblers who made shoes, tailors who made clothes, silversmiths, coopers who made barrels, carpenters, etc., etc. Increasingly, land ownership was viewed as almost a right and as the social precondition for freedom. Remember, at this time in many colonies, the ability to vote, the ability to hold office was tied more and more to the concept of land ownership. So those privileges and rights associated with freemen were increasingly based in land ownership and the wealth that was generated from that. At this time in the colonies, about 2/3 of free males, of course mostly white males, but still at this time a few of other ethnicities or races, owned land in the American colonies, whereas in England 3/5 owned no land. So there was this stark contrast between the situation in the colonies and the situation in England in regards to the masses of the population. The middle class was very aggressive in seeking continual access to new land. As the land filled up, people moved west. As that land filled up, they moved even further west, which of course continued to bring them into conflict with the Native Americans and the French who were in those regions as well. They had a strong aversion to personal dependence. The self-sufficiency was key to their sense of freedom and their sense of even their very identity. During this period, the family and the home was the center of economic life. The independence of small farmers was very much dependent on the labor of women and children, especially in New England and those backcountry areas where slavery was not as widespread. This is one of the primary reasons why you see in those areas large family groups. The more children you had, the more hands you had to work the fields or to work the sewing or to churn the butter or whatever was needed in that household economy. There were decreasing opportunities for women at this time outside of being good wives and mothers. This time saw the development of this very strong division of labor between what was considered women's work, which mainly consisted of tasks surrounding this idea of being a good wife or a good mother, which of course included much actual household labor, such as the sewing and the churning of the butter and things like that we just mentioned. And what was considered men's work, which was actual physical labor and dealing with the business activities outside of the home. So you start to see a separation of not just ideas of what was women's work and what was men's work, but what was the private sphere, which was considered the domain of women, and the public sphere, which was considered the domain of men. Concludes part 5 of our Chapter 3 lecture series and the Chapter 3 lecture series as a whole. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.